Hello all, welcome to this session. In today's session, we will briefly discuss the history of English. And what is English history? Well, in this session, I'm going to talk about the history of English people and the history of English literature. So basically, we are going to talk about everything that is English. What is literature? Well, the broad definition is that literature is any piece of writing that makes sense. So, a way of knowing a nation and its people is to study its literature, because literature is a reflection of our life and the society we live in. There are many different ways of classifying literature, such as language, origin, historical period, genre, and subject matter. So, on the basis of language, we could say, this is English literature, this is Tamil literature, this is Hindi literature, this is Assamese literature, etc. On the basis of origin, for example, if the literature is produced from the US, you could say this is American literature, or if it's produced from India, then you could say this is Indian literature. So, the purpose of literature is entertainment and reformation. We know from our past and from our history that literature has the power to make and break people, cultures, and even nations. So, literature has led to many revolutions, and therefore they say a pen is mightier than the sword. So, with all this, what I am trying to say is that literature is tied to history, and when we talk about English literature in specific, one could always say that English literature emerged with the beginning of the history of English people. And we are going to start with this, the history of English people. But before we get started with the history of English people, let's first understand the difference between Great Britain, United Kingdom, and British Isles. I've seen students use them interchangeably, which is not right. So, the first picture shows Ireland and it's marked in green. Ireland is divided into two regions, the northern part of Ireland and the Republic of Ireland, which is the central and the southern part of Ireland. Great Britain includes Scotland, England, Wales, and those few scattered islands that's marked in green. United Kingdom is a union of Wales, England, Scotland, and the northern part of Ireland, and British Isles is a union of Great Britain and Ireland. So, I hope these distinctions are clear for you now. Please keep them in mind. So, let us start with the English history, or the history of the English people. So, the earliest group of tribes inhabiting the British Isles is known as the Celts. The Celts were not one particular tribe, they were multiple tribal groups who were predominantly dependent on agriculture. So, Celts were frequently invaded by the tribes of European mainland. However, the first major invasion recorded in history is that of the Roman invasion in 43 AD. And much of what we know about the Celts is from the Roman account of Celts. And the Romans have described Celts as barbarians and people who practiced shamanism and human sacrifice and pagan religion. Now we'll talk about Roman Britannia. In the year 43 AD, in his third attempt, Emperor Claudius along with 40,000 soldiers invaded England. And in the war between the Romans and the Celts, 11 Celtic tribes surrendered to the Romans. The Romans, after invading England, began building roads and forts, and the Roman invaded England is known as Roman Britannia. However, not all Celts were ready to accept the Romans as their new rulers, and in particular is Boudicca, who was the wife of a Celtic tribal chief. And in a fight between the Celts and the Romans killed Boudicca's husband and raped her daughters. And in fury, she and a few Celtic tribes avenges the Romans by burning down the prominent cities and killing thousands of Romans. So, the condition was so bad that the then Roman king even thought of fleeing from the Roman Britannia, However, after days of attack, Bodiga was defeated, and Bodiga, instead of surrendering to the Romans, kills herself. And the Romans ruled England, that is Britannia, for the next 350 years, until the Picts, who were the tribes inhabiting Scotland, began attacking the Roman mainland. So this weakened the Romans in the mainland, and therefore the then Roman Britannia king Honorius and other Romans left Britannia in order to protect their mainland. The Britons were left to rule all by themselves. Though the Britons pleaded to stay back, the Romans did not, and the Britons finally set up their own army against the Pict and the Scottish invasion. The Romans, however, left their religion, that is Christianity, their language Latin, and well-built cities and forts behind them in the Roman Britannia. I want you to take a closer look at this map. The area marked in blue shows the Roman Empire post 43 AD. Try to understand and locate Roman Britannia and the Roman mainland. And the areas marked in yellow is actually, it was inhabited by Germanic tribes such as Jutes, Angles and Saxons. Now, this famous Oscar-winning movie Gladiator takes place in 180 AD and is loosely based on historical figures. So, Roman forces led by General Maximus, this character is played by Russell Crowe, that won him an Oscar for the best actor. He defeats Germanic tribes, bringing temporary peace to the Roman Empire. If you haven't watched this movie, well, I would suggest you to add this one to your bucket list. It's really interesting and very good movie. So, as the threat of invasion increased, the Britons decided to seek help from German mercenaries. And who are these mercenaries? They were trained army who fights for a foreign country, and they belong to the Angles and the Saxon tribes. So, the Britons seek help from the German mercenaries, that is the Anglo-Saxons, to fight the Pict. And the Anglo-Saxons helped the Britons and fought with the Picts and drove them away back to Scotland. As a token of gratitude, the Britons gave the Anglo-Saxon mercenaries some land to settle in Britain. However, to the surprise of the Britons, the Anglo-Saxons turned out to be bad neighbors, and the Britons considered them pagans, and a lot of Anglo-Saxon women and children started migrating from the European mainland and began settling down in England with the Saxon mercenaries. And conflict erupts between the Anglo-Saxons and the Britons, and finally the two sides meet at the Battle of Badon in 500 AD, and the Britons defeat the Saxons and secure their existence. Following this war, the Saxons were left with the east of England, and Britons live in the Wales. And it was during the Battle of Badon that we get to hear about King Arthur, a legendary figure who was responsible for the victory of Britons. Over the course of time, there was a mix and integration of cultures. Throughout the 7th century, the Anglo-Saxons began to convert to Christianity. The remnants of this last to this day. And despite the lack of political unity, it was a time of economic stability and prosperity. Take a closer look at this map. It shows the region inhabited by Jutes and Angles, and how the migration happens and where they settled in Britannia. After the battle, the Britons settled down in the areas that are marked in green in the British Isles. So now comes the interesting period, that is the Vikings age. So as Anglo-Saxons were taking root in England, another force not far away from England was beginning to take flight. And this force was developing in the modern day Denmark, Sweden and Norway, and were called the Vikings. The Vikings were a group of explorers and seafaring people who had been creating havoc on Europe for about 250 years. and that period is known as the Vikings Age. So the first Viking attack on England was on the island of Lindisfarne, which was recorded in the famous Anglo-Saxon chronicles, and that marks the beginning of the Viking Age in England. Next 60 years, England was plagued by Viking raids, and England took many measures to keep the Vikings away, and it was successful to a large extent. A lot of Vikings gave up on England and began raiding Scotland and Ireland. In the year 1865, a few Viking leaders and their army conquest part of England, including East Anglia, Northumbria, and Mercia. The Vikings now go on to invade Wessex, and the then king of Wessex was Ethelred. He leads an army along with his younger brother Alfred, who was only 22 years at that time. Though they were not successful initially, they met at the Battle of Ashdown, where the Vikings were defeated by the Welsh king Ethelred and his army. The Vikings retreated back to the part of England that they had conquered and called it the Danelaw. So, Danelaw is East Anglia, Northumbria, and Mercia, and you can see that in this map. Ethelred dies the same year and Alfred rises to become the king. Now let's talk about Alfred. So the Vikings did not stop with that, and there were further attempts to invade Welsh. A second battle was fought between the Vikings and King Alfred, and he emerged victorious the second time. As a result, Alfred gets two important titles placed to him in history. One is the title the Great. So we call him Alfred the Great. And the second, from the title the King of West Saxons, he goes to become the King of Anglo-Saxons, which is an idea of a unified Saxon identity. So in the year 910, Alfred's son expands his rules to the Viking Mercia, East Anglia, and York. And Edward's son further expands their kingdom and rules as a king of unified England. The Scots and the Irish were really not happy about this unity, and in fact they unified with the Vikings and fought against England in the Battle of Brunaba, which England won. And in 1978 the Vikings return on the leadership of Harold, the then king of England. Ethelred the Unready was unfit to face the Vikings, and Ethelred was forced to pay tribute to the Vikings, which greatly crippled the English economy. And in 1001, Ethelred married the daughter of the Viking king, and in 1002, he foolishly ordered the massacre of Norse settlers who were more aligned with the rising Denmark. And this leads to a 10-year conflict, and Ethelred fled to Norway, where he subsequently dies. In 1014, the king of Spain, Canute, defeats the son of Ethelred and becomes the king of England in 1016. Canute did not stop there. He went ahead and conquered Denmark and Norway, thus founding the North Sea Empire, and is also known as the Anglo-Scandinavian Empire. And Canute was the second king in the English history to have earned the title the Great. In 1042, the English Saxon Edward the Confessor took the throne from the sons of Canute. He ruled the kingdom until 1066 and he died hairless. So Harold Godwinson, the richest man of England at that point of time, took over the throne, and people hated him and saw him as an omen. And the same year, the king of Hardrada, which is the king of Norway, with an intention to restore the North Sea Empire, invaded England, and the Viking forces once again met the English Saxons at the Battle of Stamford Bridge, where they were brutally defeated. In the battle, Hardrada gets killed by an arrow. The death of Hardrada and the defeat of the Viking mark the end of Viking Age. And this also marks the end of the Old English period. Now let's talk about the literature that was produced during the Old English period. Poetry focused on heroes' bravery. Of course, that was a time when a lot of wars were fought, and the heroes of that point of time were soldiers. And many of the poems of this period are pagan, and especially Beowulf, which is the first English epic. It's a story of a brave young man, Beowulf, in 3182 lines. The author of this epic is anonymous. And in this epic poem, Beowulf sails to Denmark with a band of warriors to king this. In this epic poem, Beowulf sails to Denmark with a band of warriors to save the king of Denmark. Beowulf saves Danish king from a terrible monster called Grendel. The mother of Grendel, who sought vengeance for for the death of her son. Cut that part. Okay, let's discuss the major literary trends and highlights of this period, that is the Old English or the Anglo-Saxon period. So the first characteristic trait or the literary trend is what is known as a heroic tradition. That is, poetry produced during this period of time focused on heroes' bravery, and many of the poems of this period are pagan, especially Beowulf, which is the first English epic. It's a story of a young brave man, Beowulf, written in 3182 lines. The author of this epic is still unknown. So, in this epic poem, Beowulf sails to Denmark with a band of warriors to save the king of Denmark. Beowulf saves the Danish king from a terrible monster called Grendel, and the mother of Grendel, who sought vengeance for the death of her son, was also killed by Beowulf. And Beowulf was rewarded and he becomes the king. After a prosperous reign of some 40 years, Beowulf slays a dragon, but in the fight he himself receives a mortal wound and dies. The poem concludes with the funeral ceremonies in honor of the dead hero. Though the poem Beowulf is little interesting to contemporary readers, it's a very important poem in the Old English period because it gives an interesting picture of the life and practices of the olden days. The other poems of this period are Genesis A, Genesis B, Exodus, The Wanderer, The Seafarer, Wife's Lament, Husband's Message, Christ and Satan, Daniel, The Dream of the Rood, The Battle of Maldon, etc. And two important figures in Old English poetry are Cynewulf and Caedmon. They wrote religious poems and hymns. And another important literary trend or a tradition is seen at that point of time is what is known as the elegiac tradition, that is when writers mourn the passing of earlier better times. So it's not just our parents and grandparents who say gone are the good old days. Looks like people even at that point of time felt that the older times were the better times. Now that we have discussed the major literary trends and the highlights of the Old English period, let me quickly take you through a poem produced around this time. And this is titled The Battle of Maldon. This is actually a 325 line poem, and it celebrates Earl and his men who fell in a battle against the Vikings in 991, and is considered one of the finest poems of the Old English period. But both the beginning and the end of this poem is missing, and the only manuscript was destroyed in a fire in 1731. A well-known speech is near the end of this poem. So let me read out the translated version of this poem because it was written in Old English or the Anglo-Saxon English. Thought shall be the harder, the heart the keener, courage the greater as our strength lessens. Here lies our leader in the dust, all cut down. Always may he mourn who now thinks to turn away from this war play. I am old, I will not go away, but I plan to lie down by the side of my Lord, by the man so dearly loved. Okay, so that is with the Old English literature. I hope you liked the session. If you're interested, I would suggest you to go read more about Old English period, Old English literatures, and have a good idea about what happened or what was happening in and around Europe and the surrounding countries at that point of time. So with this, we are coming to the end of the session. I will meet you with a different topic on a different date. Until then, stay safe, take care, bye.